good morning once again, everyone. Welcome to Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction. We are already at our 15th week, and for week 15, our topic is about concept of disaster risk reduction and disaster risk reduction management. For this week, we will understand the principles of disaster risk reduction and management, and also manage different practices for disaster management. So once again, the slideshow presentation was prepared by Sir Jamal Anthony O. Garcia. So let's proceed to our discussion about the concept, principles, and relevance of disaster risk reduction or DRR. So DRR or disaster risk reduction is a term used for reducing and preventing disaster risk. It is founded on the principle that while hazards are inevitable, its adverse effects like lost lives or destruction of property are not. There are steps that we can do to ensure reduction of risk. DRR actions can be political, technical, social, and economic. So, how about disaster? Disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses or impacts, which exceeds the liability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Disasters are often described as a result of the combination of several things, such as the exposure to a hazard, the conditions of vulnerability that are present, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce or cope with the potential negative consequences. Disaster impacts may include loss of life, injury, disease, and other negative effects on human, physical, mental, and social well being, together with damage to property, destruction of assets, loss of services, social and economic disruption, and environmental degradation. So let's proceed to uh, in your handouts or PDF files. Kindly look on your uh, handouts or PDF files. We have risk, hazard, vulnerability, and capacity. So, yung risk, uh, the term disaster risk therefore refers to the potential disaster losses in lives, health, status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur in a particular community or society over some specified future time or period. Also, ang word na risk has two connotation. So, in general usage, the emphasis is usually placed on the concept of chance or possibility of an event and its negative consequences, such as the risk of an accident, whereas in technical settings, the emphasis is usually placed on the consequences in terms of potential losses for some particular cause, place, and period. Yung hazard naman, uh, sorry, hazard is defined as a dangerous phenomenon or substance, human activity or conditions that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. Ang hazard, yung hazard daw, it can be single, sequential, or combined in their origin and effects. And each hazard is characterized by its location, intensity, probability, and likely frequency. The hazards of concern to disaster risk reduction are hazards that arise from a variety of geological, meteorological, hydrological, oceanic, biological, and technological sources, sometimes acting in combination. So that is for hazard. For vulnerability, it is defined as the characteristics and circumstances of a community system or asset that make it susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard. So, na-discuss na natin to nung last week, week 14, about vulnerability. So, once again, vulnerability also comprises various physical, social, economic, political, and environmental factors that affect the ability of communities to respond to events. Meanwhile, ang capacity naman is defined as the combination of all strengths, attributes, and resources available within a community, society, or organization that can be used to achieve agreed goals. Capacity may include infrastructure and physical means, institutions, societal coping abilities, as well as human knowledge, skills, and collective attributes such as social relationships, leadership, and management. So, kaya it is very important for us to differentiate hazard from disaster. The phrase natural disaster, which is widely used often, causes confusion and has been the subject of debates. So, strictly speaking, there are no such thing as natural disasters, but there are natural hazards. So, a disaster is the result of a hazard impact on society. So, the effects of a disaster are determined by the extent of a community's vulnerability to the hazard, and so on and so forth. The vulnerability is not natural, but the result of entire range of constantly changing physical, social, economic, cultural, political, and even psychological factors that shape people's lives and create the environments in which they live. So now let's proceed to our this slide. For this slide, we will explain that hazard will always be present. Therefore, disaster reduction strategies primarily include vulnerability and risk assessment. So, the following are some factors that can affect the vulnerability of a particular community. So, what are these factors? So, we have political factor, economic factor, physical factor, and social factor. Also, environmental factor. So for political factor, basically, this is a community's vulnerability that can be linked to political will and commitment to developmental concerns. Also, lack of access to resources, infrastructure, basic services, and information can increase vulnerability as well. For economic factors, poverty has the single most important influence to vulnerability. Economic status also relates to the capacity of a community to cope and recover from adverse effects, and poverty, eradication, and creation of sustainable livelihoods are essential part of disaster risk reduction. For physical factors, access to suitable land, proper housing design and building materials, and accessibility of emergency services. And poor physical environment exposes people to hazards such as landslides, floods, fires, wind, disease, and epidemics. For social factors, level of education, training, safety and security, information and awareness, cultural beliefs, traditional values contribute to social well-being, and such as lack of awareness and access to information can result in increase of vulnerability. And the last factor is environmental factor. And of course, for this one, scarcity of resources in a community can reduce the coping solutions and recovery from a disaster. So these are the factors that can affect the vulnerability of a particular community. Once again, we have political, economic, physical, social, and environmental factors. So these are for our hazard. Next that we are going to discuss is about DRR, or disaster risk reduction. So disaster risk reduction, once again, is the concept and practice of reducing disaster risk through analysis and management of the casual factors of disasters. So it leads to reduce exposure hazards, lessening of vulnerability of people and assets, effective management of land and the environment, and improved preparedness for adverse events. Disaster risk reduction usually requires long-term planning across sectors and must be integrated into general, national, and regional development strategies. So disaster risk reduction strategies usually begin with plans for assessing the hazards and risks that threaten the target area, or the 200 the extent of the harm that would occur to communities and infrastructure, and also the vulnerable people's capacity to cope with and recover from possible disasters. So, how are we going to prevent the the disaster or the hazard? So we have here prevention, mitigation, adaptation, and preparedness. So for prevention, the outright avoidance of adverse impacts of hazard and related disasters. Prevention expresses the concept and intention to completely avoid potential adverse impacts through actions taken in advance and can be in the form of proper land use or using suitable engineering design. For mitigation, the lessening of limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. While the adverse impacts of hazards often cannot be prevented fully, their scale or severity can be substantially lessened by various strategies and actions. Mitigation measures involve a wide range of elements from engineering techniques to environmental policies and even public awareness. For adaptation, the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. This definition addresses the concerns of climate change and is sourced from the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or UNFCCC. And for the last, we have the preparedness. And for preparedness, uh, usually, dapat ito, uh, kailangan talaga to because this is the knowledge and capacities developed by government, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, or current hazard events or conditions. Preparedness action is carried out within the context of disaster risk management and aims to build the capacities needed to efficiently manage all types of emergencies and achieve orderly transitions from response to sustained recovery. So this is for our disaster risk reduction. We have the prevention, mitigation, adaptation, and preparedness bago mangyari ang isang potential hazard. So, after nung pangyayari or like for example, ito ay nangyari na naganap na, we have the post-event. So, ano yung response and how are we going to recover? So for the response, the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives, reduce health impacts, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs of the people affected. Disaster response is predominantly focused on immediate and short-term needs and is sometimes called disaster relief. For the recovery, the restoration, and improvement where appropriate of facilities, livelihoods, and living conditions of disaster-affected communities, including efforts to reduce disaster risk factors. The recovery task of rehabilitation and reconstruction begins soon after the emergency phase has ended and should be based on pre-existing strategies and policies that facilitate clear institutional responsibilities for recovery action and enable public participation. So, after ng pangyayari ng isang hazard, these are our post-event response and recovery. So, we have sa mundo, meron tayong two projects that are about raising awareness. So the first one is School Children as Disaster Risk Reduction Catalysts and Initiators in Thailand. And we also have Teaching Guide and Quiz Competitions Help Enhance Preparedness in Granada. So these are two projects that are about raising awareness. Uh, Now we also have community-based disaster risk reduction and management. So we have school children as disaster risk reduction catalysts and initiators in Thailand. So discuss natin to. So for this one, nung nangyari yung tsunami disaster, yung disaster risk reduction has been a focus of interest in Thailand. In 2006, a project called Child-Led Disaster Risk Reduction or CL DRR in Thailand project was initiated, and the principle of the project was children and youth can play an active role in community affairs that are relevant to them, especially if they are appropriately trained and supported by adults. So this is done by itong project na to, or community-based disaster risk reduction and management, is done by building children's knowledge of DRR and community risks, also building the capacity of children for DRR actions within their communities through educational campaigns, sensitizing adults, this may be the schools and communities, on the importance of involving children in DRR and other issues relevant to them. So the primary role of the project is the first role is to promote the idea of the child-led DRR among tsunami affected communities among its local partners by means of material presentation and visits. The second role is to build the CLDRR capacity of local partners, staff, and volunteers through training workshops on key DRR concepts and how to develop community risk and resource maps, how to conduct an educational campaign for DRR in a community setting, and other refresher training as needed by local partners. And the third role of the project is to provide technical and other support for the project design and implementation process, including developing a training toolkit manual on CLDRR, on the job training for partners, and regular monitoring visits to project locations. So, by this project, ano bang impact nito sa community or for the children? So these are the impacts. So first impact is children and teachers have received information and instruction on how to cope better with disasters. Also, teachers have been exposed to new alternative approaches to child-centered learning, such as new issues on disaster risk reduction and a starting point for including DRR into their school curricula. And the last impact is targeted communities have benefited from learning from the children and are making use of the children's outputs such as freeze and resource map and educational campaigns. And for this project, the lessons learned are the following. So we have here support from adults, especially from teachers, community members, and project staff is a key success factor. Children can and are willing to participate as well. Children participatory projects must involve both children and adults as well. So these are for our community-based disaster risk reduction and management. First project, which is the school children as disaster risk reduction catalysts and initiators in the country, Thailand. The next um, community-based project that we are going to discuss is the teaching guide and quiz competitions help enhance preparedness in Grenada. So Grenada is a Caribbean state that gets affected by tropical cyclones. Poor preparedness and response during Hurricane Ivan in 2004 indicated that the awareness and understanding of risks were insufficient in all sectors of their society. A teaching guide intended for grade 3 to grade 5 learners on disaster preparedness was developed under the joint coordination of the Ministry of Education and UNICEF in Grenada. Training sessions were also conducted to train teachers on how to prevent disasters, and the teaching guide helped the teachers organize the annual National Disaster Awareness Week primary school quiz competition and prepare their learners for the event. So what are the impacts of this project? So the first impact is an increase in the participation and level of knowledge of grade 5 learners in the National Disaster Awareness Week primary school quiz. Also, it is as a result of the training, uh, disaster related discussions began in school where teachers and school administrators shared their experiences of Hurricane Ivan and stressed the importance of psychological first aid resources. And the last impact is subsequently disaster managers learned to incorporate psychological first aid into their presentations to schools and school groups. The lesson learned for this community-based project is a single teaching guide can make a difference in increasing awareness and knowledge of disaster reduction among school learners, teachers, and the public at large. Organizers also had to be sensitive with regard to competing schools' workload at the time of the year, which includes school activities and commitments. And school quiz requires a coordinator with excellent organization skills to manage the scope of preparations necessary for a national level activity. Also, the support from the body, which has control over primary schools. So these are the lessons learned for these for uh, the community-based project in Granada. So sa Pinas, meron din tayong mga ganyan. So we have here children assess their own vulnerabilities, plan risk reduction in Philippines, and also we have the annual earthquake and safety drills in all schools across the country. So, familiar naman tayo na meron tayong annual earthquake and safety drill in all schools around the country. So, basically, the impact was the drill have helped expand a seismic safety culture, spread the drill earth experience to non-school areas, and make earthquake safety a national activity. Also, another one is a culture of safety at all levels of society and increase children's knowledge and share this knowledge with their families, friends, and community. Lessons learned education plays a key role in promoting safety measures against earthquakes and spreading them in the society. And another lesson learned is a major challenge initially was to secure the cooperation of many institutions and organizations, such as mass media. This was overcome through persistent advocacy and continuous follow-up to secure cooperation of many institutions. So this is for our community-based project here in the Philippines. Ito yung annual earthquake and safety drills in all schools across the country. So for week 15 references, we have kindly look at your handouts or PDF files, and we also have two activity requirements. We have activity 1 and activity 2. So for activity 1, do a research, and for activity 2, discussion and presentation. So we have three questions for two activities. For first activity, three researches, and for activity 2, we have two questions. So once again, for week 15, we have mainly understood the principles of disaster risk reduction and management. And also, we had managed different practices for disaster management. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us. You may reach us personally through our group chat or through direct message in Facebook Messenger as well. So I hope, let's see, our next lesson for week 16 is the concept of another continuation for this 15th week lesson, but we will be more broad to it, and this will be more knowledgeable for us because we will know the four themes in disaster risk reduction management framework, and also we will be able to prepare our own disaster kit for week 16. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. So once again, thank you, Sir Gemwell, for this PowerPoint presentation. So finally, week 15, disaster risk readiness and reduction.